A dozen years before the war, I was spending the summer on the Riviera at a cozy guest house. One day at lunch, a heated argument flared up, threatening to escalate into a genuine quarrel, complete with biting remarks and even insults. Most people lack a vivid imagination. What happens far away does not touch their souls. It passes them by. But let even a trivial incident occur right before their eyes, tangibly close, and passions ignite with unexpected force. At such moments, people seem to compensate for their usual indifference with excessive, unbridled fervor. So it was with our respectable little company. At lunch, we had been engaged in casual conversation, light small talk, exchanging jokes, and after the meal, we would each go our separate ways. The German couple would set off on a walk with their camera, the good-natured Dane to his tedious fishing rods, the English lady to her books, the Italian spouses would hurry off to Monte Carlo, and I would either laze about in a wicker chair or settle down to work. But that day, everything went differently. We became locked in a stormy altercation, and if anyone jumped up from the table, it was certainly not to politely take their leave, but in the heat of the dispute, which by the end had acquired a most acrimonious character. The cause that stirred our little dining circle was indeed extraordinary. The guest house, where 7 of us resided, resembled a private villa, and from its windows, a marvelous view of the shoreline rocks unfolded. In reality, however, it was merely an annex of the Grand Palace Hotel, connected to it by a garden. We lived apart, but constantly crossed paths with the hotel's guests. And so, a scandal had erupted in that very hotel the day before. On the midday train, which arrived exactly at 12:20, the time is important, it played a role in our argument. A young Frenchman had arrived and taken a room with a sea view, which in itself spoke of his means. He immediately attracted attention not only through his elegance, but also through his exceptional appearance. An elongated, almost feminine face, silky fair hair above, sensual lips, soft, wavy chestnut locks with a curly strand falling over his white forehead, velvety eyes. Everything about him was beautiful with a soft, ingratiating kind of beauty. He conducted himself with consideration and courtesy, but without affectation. If at first glance he resembled a wax mannequin from a fashion boutique window, this impression vanished upon personal interaction. His amiability was natural, innate. He greeted everyone modestly and cordially, and it was a pleasure to observe how his elegance and refinement manifested in the simplest gestures. He would hasten to hand a lady her coat as she headed to the cloakroom, bestow a tender glance or a joke upon every child, and was courteous without a hint of familiarity. He seemed to be one of those fortunate individuals whose confidence in their own charm only enhances their appeal. His presence had a beneficial effect on the elderly and infirm people, of whom there were many here. With his freshness, cheerfulness, and the triumphant smile of youth, he immediately won universal favor. Within 2 hours of his arrival, he was already playing tennis with the daughters of the good-natured, portly factory owner from Lyon, 12-year-old Annette and 13-year-old Blanche. Their mother, the delicate, graceful Madame Henriette, watched with a restrained smile as her fledgling chicks flirted with the young stranger. In the evening, he spent about an hour watching us play chess, told several amusing anecdotes, took a long walk along the promenade with Madame Henriette. Her husband, as usual, was playing dominoes with a friend, a factory owner from Namur, and late in the evening, I came upon him in the dimly lit hotel office, engaged in an intimate conversation with the secretary. The next morning, he accompanied the Dane on his fishing trip, demonstrating surprising knowledge in the process, then had a long conversation with the Lyonnais factory owner about politics. And judging by the man's booming laughter, he was a fascinating conversationalist. After lunch, I am deliberately describing his day in detail. He again spent an hour with Madame Henriette in the garden over a cup of black coffee, then played tennis with her daughters and conversed with the German couple in the lobby. At 6 o'clock, I went to the station to mail a letter and suddenly saw him. He hurried over to me and, as if apologizing, said that he had been unexpectedly called away, but would return in 2 days. At dinner, he was absent, physically, but not in conversation. At every table, he was the sole topic of discussion, with everyone praising his cheerful, pleasant nature. Late in the evening, around 11, I was sitting in my room, finishing a book, when suddenly, through the open window facing the garden, came the sound of alarmed shouts and agitated exclamations. Some commotion had broken out in the hotel. More concerned than curious, I immediately went down to the garden and covered the 50 paces that separated our villa from the main building. There I found guests and staff in a state of extreme agitation. Madame Henriette had not returned from her evening walk along the shore, which she took daily while her husband, following his established routine, played dominoes with his friend. Everyone feared a misfortune had occurred. The usually slow and ponderous man was rushing about the shore like an enraged bull, and when he shouted into the darkness, "Henriette! Henriette!" there was something primal and terrifying in his voice, breaking with emotion, reminiscent of the death roar of a wounded animal. Waiters and bellboys were running up and down the stairs. They had woken all the guests and called the police. And the factory owner himself, his waistcoat unbuttoned, dashed in all directions, senselessly shouting into the night, "Henriette! Henriette!" The girls had woken up and, standing at the window in their nightgowns, were calling for their mother. Their father hurried upstairs to comfort them. And then something terrible happened, something almost impossible to describe. In moments of extreme emotional intensity, the human countenance holds such tragedy that neither pen nor brush can convey it. The factory owner came back down the stairs, which creaked under his weight, with a face etched with infinite weariness and anger. In his hand, he held a letter. "Call everyone back," he said to the manager, barely audibly. "Call the people back. It's not needed. My wife has left me." This mortally wounded man possessed the superhuman composure not to show his grief before the crowd that had gathered around him. People who at first stared at him with curiosity, but now, frightened and ashamed, turned away. Summoning his last reserves of strength, he walked past everyone without looking at anyone, entered the reading room, and turned off the light. Soon we heard the dull thud of his heavy body collapsing into an armchair, followed by loud, desperate sobs, the kind of weeping only possible from one who has never wept before. This elemental grief shook all of us, even the most indifferent. Not a single waiter, not one of the curious guests, dared to smile or utter a word of sympathy. Silently, one after another, as if shamed by this devastating outburst of feeling, we stole away to our rooms. And there, in the dark reading room, alone with himself, this grief-stricken man sobbed, until one by one the lights went out in the house, now filled with whispers, rustles, and sighs. Naturally, such an incident, erupting before our eyes like a thunderclap, profoundly shocked people accustomed to a monotonous and serene existence. But although this event was the immediate cause of the fierce clashes at our table, which nearly led to mutual insults, the essence of the dispute lay deeper in a clash of opposing worldviews. Thanks to the indiscretion of a maid who had read the letter, which the husband in a fit of helpless rage had crumpled and thrown to the floor, it became known that Madame Henriette had not left alone, but had conspired with that very young Frenchman, for whom the majority's sympathy was now rapidly dwindling. On the surface, there was nothing astonishing about it. Another Madame Bovary had left her provincial, portly husband for an elegant, handsome man. But what stunned and outraged everyone in the house was the fact that neither the factory owner himself, nor his daughters, nor even Madame Henriette had ever met this man before. It turned out that a 2-hour evening walk along the promenade and 1 hour over a cup of coffee in the garden had been enough for this 33-year-old respectable woman to abandon her husband and children the very next day and, without a second thought, follow a complete stranger. This seemingly obvious fact was unanimously rejected by our dining circle. Everyone perceived the event as a premeditated elopement. Madame Henriette, in their opinion, had long been involved in a secret affair with this lady's man, and had arrived merely for the final escape. It's impossible, everyone asserted, for a respectable woman to run off at the first call after a mere 3 hours of acquaintance. Arguing for the sake of it, I began to defend the opposite viewpoint. The possibility, indeed the probability, of a sudden decision in a woman who, weary of years of a tedious marriage, was inwardly prepared to yield to the first bold onslaught. My unexpected objections added fuel to the fire, and the dispute became general. Passions flared up especially when both married couples, the German and the Italian, began, with openly offensive contempt, to deny the possibility of a coup de foudre, love at first sight, dismissing it as an absurd and vulgar romantic fiction. There is little point in recounting every detail of the verbal skirmish that stretched from the soup to the pudding. At a table d'hôte, only true wits are brilliant, and the arguments hastily mustered in the heat of a casual dinner debate are most often banal, rushed, and spoken at random. It is hard to say why our conversation so rapidly acquired a caustic edge. Likely, it was the subconscious urge of both married couples to exclude any possibility of such frivolity and threat to their own wives. Alas, they found no better retort than to imply that only a man who judges women by the casual, cheap conquests of a bachelor's life could speak as I did. This stung me, and when the German lady, with the air of an expert, began lecturing me that there are real women and then there are born prostitutes, a category to which she assigned Madame Henriette, my patience snapped, and I went on the offensive. I said that it is the fear of one's own desires, of that demonic element which lives within each of us, that compels one to deny the obvious. There are moments when a woman, in the thrall of mysterious forces, loses control over herself, her will, and her reason. I added that some people apparently find it gratifying to consider themselves stronger, more decent, and purer than those who yield easily to temptation. But in my opinion, the woman who passionately and freely surrenders to her desire acts far more honestly than one who, with eyes closed, deceives her husband right in his embrace, as is, alas, the common practice. That, more or less, is what I said. And the more fiercely the others attacked the poor Madame Henriette, the more ardently I defended her, though I confess this did not entirely align with my own inner convictions. My words, like rapier thrusts, struck a nerve in both married couples. Forming a discordant quartet, they fell upon me with such vehemence that the old, good-natured Dane, who had been observing us like a football referee with a stopwatch, was forced to tap the table from time to time. Gentlemen, please. But helped only briefly. One of the husbands, flushed the color of a boiled lobster, had already leapt to his feet 3 times, and only his wife's pleas restrained him from an outburst. A little more, and the argument would have descended into a physical altercation, had it not been for the intervention of Mrs. C., who unexpectedly poured oil on the turbulent waters of our discourse. Mrs. C., a stately, elderly Englishwoman with snow-white hair, was by unspoken agreement the honorary chairwoman of our table. She carried herself with dignity, was equally courteous to everyone, spoke little, but listened to conversations with great attentiveness. Her very appearance had a calming effect. An aura of tranquility and aristocratic reserve emanated from her. She formed no close bonds with anyone, yet showed consideration to all. She usually sat in the garden with a book, sometimes played the piano, and only occasionally joined the company for a lively chat. Her presence was almost unnoticeable, yet we all involuntarily submitted to her influence. And now, the moment she began to speak, we felt acutely ashamed of our noisy and unrestrained manner of arguing. Mrs. C. seized the pause that followed after the German had jumped up sharply, but, at a word from his wife, had obediently returned to his seat. She raised her clear gray eyes, glanced at me hesitantly, and then, with her characteristic businesslike precision, clarified the essence of our dispute. Then, if I understand you correctly, she said, you maintain that Madame Henriette, that a woman can be swept into an unexpected adventure, commit an act which an hour before would have seemed unthinkable even to her, and that she cannot be blamed for it. I'm absolutely convinced of it, madam, I replied. In that case, you reject all moral standards, and any transgression can be justified. If you truly believe that a crime passional, as the French say, is no crime, then it follows that state justice loses its meaning altogether. Then, with a certain persistence, and you, I confess, are trying very hard, one could find passion in any crime and use it as an excuse, she added with a slight smile. She spoke calmly, almost with a cheerful undertone, and I liked this so much that, involuntarily imitating her businesslike tone, I answered in the same vein, half in jest, half in earnest. State justice is undoubtedly stricter than I am. Its duty is to protect public morals and decency, and thus it is compelled to condemn, not to absolve. I, however, as a private individual, see no point in playing the prosecutor. I prefer the role of the defender. Personally, I find it more agreeable to try and understand a person than to judge them. Mrs. C.'s clear gray eyes rested on me intently for a moment. She hesitated with her reply. I thought perhaps she hadn't fully grasped my meaning and was about to repeat it in English, but she spoke again with unexpected seriousness, as if conducting an examination. But don't you find it degrading, repulsive, for a woman to abandon her husband and 2 children to follow a complete stranger, without even knowing if he is worthy of her love? Can you truly be prepared to excuse such frivolous and thoughtless behavior in a woman who, moreover, is no longer young and should, if only for her children's sake, have comported herself more honorably? I repeat, madam, I answered, I do not presume to judge or to condemn. I confess to you frankly, I may have slightly exaggerated. Poor Madame Henriette is certainly no heroine, no thrill-seeker, and most definitely not a passionate nature. As far as I know her, she is a very ordinary, weak woman, for whom I feel a certain respect for having found the courage to yield to her desire. But she evokes even more pity in me, because I fear she will be profoundly unhappy very soon. What she did may have been foolish and undoubtedly rash, but to call her action base or vile is impossible. That is why I insist. No one has the right to despise this unfortunate woman. And you yourself? Do you still respect her? Do you draw no line between the respectable woman you conversed with the day before yesterday and this other woman who yesterday ran off with the first man she met? None at all. Absolutely none. Not the slightest. Is that so? She uttered involuntarily in English. The conversation seemed to have truly engaged her. After a short pause, she looked at me again with a questioning gaze. And if you were to meet Madame Henriette tomorrow, say, in Nice, on the arm of that young man, would you bow to her? Most certainly. And would you speak to her? Of course. And if you were married, would you introduce her to your wife, as if nothing had happened? Yes, without fail. Would you really? She asked again in English, her voice tinged with genuine disbelief and astonishment. Surely I would. I answered her in the same language. Mrs. C. fell silent. She seemed to be pondering something intensely. And suddenly, as if surprised by her own resolve, she said, looking at me, I don't know if I would. Perhaps I might do it also. And with that remarkable ease which only the English possess for courteously yet decisively ending a conversation, she rose and amiably offered me her hand. Her intervention had restored calm, and in our hearts, all of us, so recently bitter opponents, were grateful to her for dispelling the tense, thunderous atmosphere. After exchanging a few harmless pleasantries, we said our polite goodbyes and parted. Although the dispute had concluded in a most gentlemanly fashion, a distinct coolness had nonetheless arisen between me and my opponents. The German couple maintained a frosty reserve, and the Italians amused themselves by asking me daily, with sly mockery, if I had heard anything about the cara Signora Henrietta. The former cordiality, the easy, heartfelt communication that had once reigned at our table, had vanished irrevocably. The ironic aloofness of my adversaries was felt all the more sharply against the backdrop of the unexpected attention Mrs. C. began to show me. Usually exceptionally reserved and disinclined to conversation outside of mealtimes, she now frequently initiated talks with me in the garden and, I might even say, singled me out. For even a brief conversation with her was perceived as a mark of special favor. Frankly, it was as if she were seeking my company, using any pretext to start discussion. This was so obvious that foolish, conceited thoughts might have entered my head, were it not for her age and her gray hair. But no matter what we discussed, the conversation invariably returned to Madame Henriette. It seemed Mrs. C. derived a strange satisfaction from condemning the duty-forgetful woman for her frivolity and fickleness. And yet, at the same time, she appeared pleased that my sympathies remained steadfastly with the fragile, elegant Madame Henriette, and that I could not be swayed to renounce them. She persistently returned to this topic, and I no longer knew what to make of her almost obsessive insistence. This continued for 5 or 6 days, and throughout this time she never gave the slightest hint as to why these conversations held such fascination for her. But I became utterly convinced of her deep personal involvement when, during a walk, I mentioned that my stay was nearing its end and that I planned to leave the day after tomorrow. Her usually imperturbable face showed distinct agitation, and her gray eyes darkened. What a pity! There is so much more I wish to discuss with you. From that moment, judging by her distracted air and inner restlessness, I understood that she was completely absorbed by some thought. Eventually, she seemed to realize it herself. Breaking off our talk, she pressed my hand and said, "At the moment, I'm unable to express clearly what I wish to say. It would be better if I wrote to you." And, contrary to her usual leisurely pace, she walked briskly back towards the house. Indeed, that evening, shortly before dinner, I found a letter in my room, written in her vigorous, confident hand. Unfortunately, in my youth, I was careless with correspondence, and thus I cannot reproduce it verbatim, only convey its essence. She wrote that she was aware of the strangeness of her behavior, but wished to tell me about an episode from her own life. It happened long ago, and perhaps no longer held significance for her present existence. But since I was soon departing, it would be easier for her to share what had been troubling her for over 20 years. Therefore, if I did not consider it an imposition, she asked me to grant her 1 hour of my time. The letter, whose content I relay only in its general terms, intrigued me profoundly. The mere fact that it was written in English lent it a particular clarity and resolve. Yet, crafting a reply did not come easily to me. I tore up 3 drafts before finally writing the following. "I am deeply honored by your confidence and promise to answer you honestly, should you desire it. Of course, I would not presume to ask you to reveal more than you yourself wish. But I beg you, in your narrative, be truthful, both to me and to yourself. I repeat, I consider your trust a great honor." That evening, the note was delivered to her room, and the next morning I received a reply. "I quite agree with you. Truth is only valuable when it is complete. Half-truths are nothing. I shall try with all my might to withhold not a single detail from myself or from you. Come to my room after dinner. At my age of 67, I need not fear gossip. I did not wish to speak of this in the garden or in the presence of others. Believe me, it was difficult enough to resolve to have this conversation. We saw each other at the table during the day and conducted a decorous conversation on neutral topics. But later in the garden, when I happened to meet her, she stepped aside with evident embarrassment, and it was touching to see this elderly, gray-haired woman turn into a side path with a maidenly timidity. In the evening, at the appointed hour, I knocked on her door. She opened it immediately. The room was bathed in a soft twilight. Only a small desk lamp was lit, casting a warm circle of light. Mrs. C. rose calmly to meet me, invited me to sit, and settled herself opposite. I felt that every one of her movements had been considered and measured in advance. And yet, despite her efforts, a pause ensued, growing more and more oppressive. I did not dare to speak, sensing the struggle within her, while clashing with inner resistance. From downstairs, from the lounge, snippets of a waltz drifted up, and I tried to listen to the music to somewhat dispel the stifling silence. Apparently, she too felt the unnatural tension, for she suddenly gathered herself, as if for a leap, and began to speak. The most difficult thing is to begin. For 2 days now, I have resolved to be utterly frank and truthful. I hope I can manage it. Perhaps it is not yet clear to you why I am telling all this to you, a man I barely know. But there is not a day, not an hour, when I do not think about this event. I am an old woman, and you can believe me. It is unbearable to be chained for a lifetime to a single moment, to one day. Everything I wish to tell you happened within 24 hours, and I have lived for 67 years. I repeat to myself until I am weary What does it matter if I acted recklessly just one single time? But to rid oneself of what we call conscience is not so simple. When I heard how calmly you spoke of Madame Henriette, I thought, perhaps if I resolved to talk frankly with someone about that day, I might finally free myself from these senseless torments and constant self-reproach. Were I a Catholic, I would have long since found relief in confession. But I, an Anglican, am denied such solace. That is why I have taken this strange step, to try and justify myself by telling you my story. Yes, it is unusual, but you accepted my proposal without hesitation, and I am grateful to you for that. As I have already said, I wish to tell you about only one day of my life. All the rest seems insignificant to me now and would probably seem tedious to others. How I lived until the age of 42 could be described in a few words. My parents were wealthy landowners, owning factories and estates in Scotland. Like many old aristocratic families, we spent most of the year on our estates and the winter season in London. At 18, I met my future husband. He was a younger son of the noble family of R, and had served for 10 years as an officer in India. We married soon after and led the carefree life of people of our circle. 3 months in London, 3 on the estates, the rest of the time traveling through Italy, Spain, and France. Our family life was cloudless. Both my sons are long since grown. When I turned 40, my husband died suddenly. He had brought a liver disease back from the tropics, and within 2 weeks he was gone. My elder son was already serving in the Navy, the younger was at college. Overnight, I was left alone. After so many years of shared life, this solitude became unbearable for me. To remain another day in the house, full of memories of my beloved husband, was beyond my strength. I decided that for the next few years, until my sons started families of their own, I would spend my time traveling. From that moment on, my life lost all meaning and became a burden to me. My husband, with whom I had shared every thought and feeling for 22 years, was gone, and my children no longer needed me. I was afraid of casting a shadow over their youth with my grief and melancholy. I was left with no hopes, no aspirations. First, I went to Paris, wandering aimlessly through shops and museums, but neither the city nor its objects spoke to me. I avoided people. I was in mourning and could not bear their sympathetic, respectful glances. I cannot describe the passing of those months of aimless wandering. Everything was as if in a fog. I was like a blind woman. I remember only one thing. A passionate desire for death never left me, yet I lacked the resolve to bring about the desired end. In the second year of my widowhood, at 42, fleeing the oppressive loneliness and not knowing how to fill the void, I found myself in Monte Carlo in March. To tell the truth, I went there out of boredom, driven by a tedious, soul-crushing emptiness that rose to my heart like nausea, demanding at least some minimal external impressions. The deeper my inner numbness, the more I was drawn to places where life spun faster. When one has no experiences of one's own, the passions of others can be stimulating, like the theater or music. That is why I often visited the casino. I derived a strange pleasure from observing the joy and disappointment of the gamblers. Their excitement and anxiety slightly dispersed my own tormenting anguish. Furthermore, my husband, though not a frivolous man, had enjoyed visiting the gaming rooms, and I, guided by an unconscious piety, imitated his habits. Thus began those 24 hours which proved more thrilling than any game, and clouded my life for years to come. That evening, I had dined with the Duchess of M., a relation of mine. After dinner, Feeling not yet tired enough to sleep, I went to the casino. I did not play myself, but simply wandered between the tables, observing people in a particular way. I say particular because my late husband had taught me this method. Once, when I complained to him that I was tired of seeing the same faces, wrinkled old women waiting for hours to place a bet, hardened professionals, and the inevitable courtesans, he suggested a different perspective. This crowd, far less picturesque than in cheap novels which depict it as the fleur d'elegance and European aristocracy, seemed tiresome to me. Moreover, 20 years earlier, when real gold glittered here, banknotes rustled, Napoleons jingled, and 5-franc pieces clinked, the casino presented a much livelier and more captivating spectacle than the present pompous gambling house, where tourists anonymously fritter away their chips. But even then, the faces of the players held little interest for me. My husband, who was fond of palmistry, showed me a different, far more fascinating way of observing. Not to look at faces, but to focus on the quadrilateral of the table, on the players' hands, on their movements and behavior. I don't know if you have ever looked solely at the green baize, in the center of which the roulette ball darts about like a drunkard, and at the numbered squares covered with plaques and gold and silver coins, watching as the croupier with a single sweep of his rake gathers the entire harvest or pushes it over to a lucky winner. From this angle, the only living things at the table are the hands. A multitude of hands, pale, agile, watchful, peering from sleeves as if from burrows. Each one is like a predator ready to pounce. They are all different, some bare, others laden with rings and jingling chains, some hairy like wild beasts, others moist and slithery like eels. But all are tense, trembling with monstrous impatience. I couldn't help but think of a racetrack. At the start, they struggle to hold back the heated horses to keep them from bolting too soon. They tremble just the same, strain forward, rear up. You can learn everything from these hands: how they wait, how they snatch, how they hesitate. The miser is betrayed by his claw-like grip, the spendthrift by his careless gesture, the calculating man by his calm, assured hand, the desperate one by the trembling of his fingers. Hundreds of characters are instantly revealed in the way a person handles money. Some crumple it, others nervously fiddle with it, and some, exhausted, simply unclench their fingers and leave the banknotes on the table, skipping their turn. A person is revealed in play. This is well known. But they are betrayed even more by their own hand. Nearly all players know how to control their faces. Above the snow-white collar, a mask of impassibility, smooth creases around the mouth, clenched teeth, eyes that conceal anxiety. They suppress muscle twitches and force an expression of deliberate indifference onto their faces. But precisely because all attention is focused on the face, they forget about their hands. And yet, there are observers who read in them everything that is vainly hidden behind an affected smile and feigned calm. Hands are shameless traitors. There comes a moment when even the most disciplined fingers lose control. In that second when the roulette ball drops into its pocket and the croupier calls the number, each 100 hands makes its own peculiar, instinctive movement. And if you learn to see this, as my husband, an avid observer, taught me, then this spectacle becomes more gripping than any theater or music. I cannot even convey how vastly different gamblers' hands can be. Wild ones, with hairy, crooked fingers that scoop up gold spider-like. Nervous, trembling ones with pale nails, barely daring to touch the money. Noble and coarse ones, timid and brazen, cunning and hesitant. Each pair lives its own life. The exception is the 4 or 5 pairs of hands belonging to the croupiers. They are true automatons. They click like steel bolts, operating with precision and indifference. But it is their sobriety and businesslike manner that make a strong impression against the backdrop of the greed and excitement of the others. I would say they are like policemen in uniform amidst a noisy, agitated crowd. A particular pleasure for me was learning the habits of these hands. After just 2 or 3 days, I began to recognize acquaintances among them, and I divided them, as one does people, into pleasant and repulsive. Some disgusted me so much with their fidgety greed that I turned away as from something obscene. Every new hand at the table meant a new experience for me. At times, watching these treacherous fingers, I even forgot to look at the face looming above the starched shirt front of a tuxedo or the diamond-sparkling bodice. A cold, society face, masked and composed. That evening, I entered the hall, passed 2 overcrowded tables, and approached a third. As I was taking gold coins from my purse, I suddenly heard, amid the resonant, terribly tense silence that falls each time the ball, already mortally tired, darts between 2 numbers, a strange cracking, crunching sound, as if joints were being broken. Involuntarily, I raised my eyes, and directly opposite me saw something that truly horrified me. 2 hands, the likes of which I had never seen before. They were clawed into each other like enraged beasts, squeezing and wrenching in a frantic struggle, making the fingers emit a dry crack, as if someone were splitting a nut. They were hands of rare, almost aristocratic beauty, muscular, unusually long and narrow, very white, with pale nails and elegant, pearly lunulae. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them all evening. They were striking in their uniqueness, but simultaneously frightening. In their convulsive grip, in this intense duel, one sensed a mad passion. I understood immediately. A person overflowing with inner fire had driven it into his fingers to keep from being torn apart from within. And then, in the very second when the ball dropped into its pocket with a dry click and the croupier called the number, the hands suddenly sprang apart, like 2 beasts felled by a single bullet. They collapsed, not merely weary, but as if dead, slumping with an expression of hopelessness, despair, and disappointment that is impossible to convey in words. Never before or since have I seen such speaking hands. Every muscle in them screamed, passion seeped from every pore. For a moment they lay on the green baize, limp and motionless, like jellyfish washed ashore. Then the right hand slowly began to revive, starting from the fingertips. It trembled, recoiled, darted about the table, then nervously snatched a jeton, rolling it between thumb and forefinger like a little wheel. Suddenly it arched, like a panther, and spat, 100-franc jeton onto the middle of the black. And immediately, as if on command, the left hand stirred. It lifted, crept, crawled towards its trembling sister, and both lay side by side, quivering, their wrists tapping against the table like chattering teeth. I had never before seen hands that expressed such feverish excitement so vividly. Everything around, the hum of voices, the shouts of the croupiers, the bustling figures, the ball hopping in its polished cage, all of it suddenly seemed dead, frozen compared to these hands, trembling, gasping, waiting, shuddering. I watched them as if spellbound. But I could no longer contain myself. I had to see the face of the man to whom these magical hands belonged. And, with a sense of genuine dread, my gaze cautiously traveled from the wrists to the sleeves, to the narrow shoulders. And again I shuddered. The face spoke the same language of insane tension as the hands. Delicate, almost femininely beautiful, it expressed the same storm of passions. Never had I seen such a lost, absent face. It was like a mask, a sculpture without eyes, because the eyes saw nothing, noticed nothing. The black, glazed pupils stared fixedly, as if reflecting that dark red ball playfully spinning in its round prison. I repeat, never had I encountered a face that so openly, so nakedly and shamelessly expressed passion. Narrow, delicate, slightly elongated, it belonged to a young man of about 25. Like the hands, it did not seem particularly masculine, more like that of a possessed youth. But I understood all this later. In that moment, it was pure passion, pure frenzy. The thin lips were slightly parted, and even from 10 paces away, I could see his teeth chattering feverishly. A light lock of hair was stuck to his forehead, and the skin around his nostrils fluttered incessantly, as if waves were rolling beneath it. His head kept leaning forward, as if ready to dive into the vortex of the roulette wheel. And only then did I understand why the hands had been so convulsively clenched. Only that tension kept his body from falling. Never before had I seen a face where passion was so exposed. I couldn't look away, fascinated by its madness, just as he was by the bouncing ball. From that moment, everything around me vanished. It all seemed pale, blurred gray, compared to the fire blazing on that face. I watched him for a good hour, observing his every movement. Then a light flared in his eyes, his hands flew apart, his fingers stretched out. The croupier pushed 20 gold coins towards him. His face beamed, grew younger, smoothed out. His eyes sparkled, his body straightened. He sat freely, like a rider in the saddle, triumphant in victory. His fingers played with the coins, clinking them together, making them dance and ring melodiously. Then he turned his head again, swept the table with a hunter's gaze, and suddenly, with a jerk, threw the entire pile onto one of the squares. And again, the tense wait. Waves of trembling crept from his lips to his nose, his hands clenched, his face disappeared behind a mask of greedy impatience. And then disappointment. His face withered, faded, grew pale and old, his gaze extinguished. He had lost. For a few seconds he sat, staring blankly ahead, as if not comprehending. But then, as if spurred by the croupier's shout, his fingers grabbed a few coins again. There was no confidence left. He threw them onto one field, then changed his mind, flung them onto another. And when the ball was already in motion, with a trembling hand, he threw 2 more crumpled banknotes onto the same square. This captivating sequence of wins and losses continued without interruption for about an hour, and all that time, holding my breath, I did not tear my enchanted gaze away from that endlessly changing face, upon which passions raged like tides. I could not look away from those magical hands, every muscle of which sculpturally conveyed the rising and falling curve of his experience. Never in a theater had I scrutinized an actor's face so intently as I did this one. Across it, like light and shadow on a landscape, played an endlessly shifting scale of feelings and nuances. Never before had I been so captivated by a game as by this reflection of another's agitation. Had anyone observed me at that moment, they would have thought me under hypnosis. And indeed, my state was close to complete stupor. I could not tear myself away from that face, and everything around me, the lights, the laughter, the people, was felt only as a vague, yellow haze, within which this face blazed, a fire among fires. I heard nothing, felt nothing, did not notice how people jostled around me, how other hands like tentacles threw money or raked it in. I did not follow the ball, did not hear the croupier's voice, and yet simultaneously, as if in a dream, I saw everything that was happening. Through these hands, through this face clearly, as if in a magnified reflection from a concave mirror, thanks to the man's passionate tension. Whether the ball fell on black or red, spun or settled, I had no need to look at the roulette wheel. Everything, winning and losing, hope and disappointment, was reflected with incredible force in his mimicry and gestures. But then came a terrible moment. What I had vaguely feared all along, what had pressed on me like an approaching storm, suddenly struck my strained nerves. The ball, with a short, rattling sound, dropped into a pocket. A second's pause followed. 100 people held their breath. The croupier's voice pronounced, "Zero," and his nimble rake was already scraping up the clinking coins and rustling banknotes. In that instant, the clenched hands made an indescribably dreadful movement. They seemed to leap up to grab something that wasn't there, and then collapsed onto the table in exhaustion. Then they suddenly came alive again, fled from the bays, began scrambling over his body like wild cats. Up, down, right, left, feverishly rummaging through his pockets in search of a single forgotten coin. They returned empty, again and again renewing their furious, useless search, while the roulette wheel was already spinning again, and the game continued. Coins clinked, chairs moved, 1,000 soft sounds filled the hall. I trembled, shaken with horror. I experienced everything so acutely, as if it were my own fingers desperately scrabbling in the folds of my dress, in my pockets, searching for a last chance. And suddenly he, sitting opposite me, jumped up sharply like a man overcome by nausea. His chair clattered backwards, but he didn't notice it, didn't see the people fearfully making way for him, and, swaying, stumbled away. I froze. In that same second, I understood where he was going, to his ruin. Someone who rises like that is not heading to a hotel, or a restaurant, or to a woman, or to the station. He is going straight into the abyss. Even the most hardened souls in that hell must have felt. He had nothing left. No home, no money, no family. He had staked everything, and now, having lost, he was leaving for that place from which there is no return. I had feared this all along. From the first glance, I felt it wasn't about money, but about life itself. I knew, such an all-consuming passion sooner or later destroys itself. But still, the moment I saw the life go out of his eyes and death veil his face with a gray pallor, struck me like black lightning. And so powerful was the impact of his gestures that when he started from his place and staggered away, I instinctively gripped the table. I felt the uncertainty of his gait with my whole body, just as I had felt his excitement with every fiber of my soul before. Something pushed me. I had to follow him. My legs moved of their own accord. I wasn't even conscious of what I was doing. Heeding no one, beside myself, I walked. I ran down the corridor towards the exit. He was standing at the cloakroom. The attendant was handing him his coat. But his arms wouldn't obey, and the attendant, as if helping an invalid, assisted him into the sleeves. I saw him mechanically reach into his waistcoat pocket for a tip, but it was empty. Then, as if remembering everything, he muttered something in embarrassment, lunged forward again, and heavily, like a drunkard, began to descend the casino stairs, followed first by the attendant's contemptuous, then pitying smirk. It was so dreadful that I felt ashamed to watch him. I turned away, embarrassed, as if I were observing someone else's suffering in a theater. But immediately, that unconscious fear pushed me again. I quickly threw on my coat and, now, without a single thought, like an automaton, rushed out into the darkness after this lost stranger. Mrs. C fell silent for a moment. She sat opposite me, motionless, having spoken almost without pause, with her characteristic thoroughness and calm, as if she had thought everything through in advance and meticulously reconstructed the sequence of events in her memory. And now, for the first time, she faltered and broke off her narrative. "I promised you and myself," she began with noticeable emotion, "to be utterly frank. And now I ask you, trust me and do not look for hidden motives in my actions, motives which I might not even be ashamed of now, but which simply did not exist then. I repeat, when I ran out into the street after that desperate gambler, I was not in love with him, nor did I even perceive him as a man. I was over 40, and, since my husband's death, I had never looked at a man with interest. That part of my life was over. I must tell you this, otherwise you will not feel the full horror of what happened next. To be honest, I find it difficult to define the feeling that so powerfully drove me to follow this unfortunate man. There was curiosity in it, but above all, there was fear. Fear of something terrible that I had sensed from the very first minute. Fear of an invisible cloud hanging over this youth. But such sensations cannot be dissected, analyzed. They are too sudden, too imperious. Probably my impulse was simply an instinctive desire to help, like snatching a child back from running under a car. Can one explain why a person who cannot swim jumps from a bridge after a drowning man? They are driven by an irresistible force that gives no time to think, to realize how dangerous and futile it is. And so it was with me, without thinking, without conscious reason. I followed him from the gaming hall to the foyer, and from there to the square in front of the casino. I'm sure that you and any sensitive person would have involuntarily yielded to this alarming impulse. It is impossible to imagine a more terrible sight than this young man, no older than 25, staggering like a drunkard, slowly, like an old man, dragging his feet down the stairs. Having descended, he collapsed onto a bench like a sack, and again I shuddered. This was a man in whom nothing any longer clung to life. His head lolled to the side, his arms hung limply along his body, and in the dim light of the street lamp, he looked like someone who had just put a bullet through his head. I cannot explain how this vision arose, but it appeared before me with frightening clarity. I saw him dead. I was sure there was a revolver in his pocket, and that tomorrow he would be found on this or another bench, drenched in blood. He had fallen like a stone into an abyss, without stopping, right to the bottom. I had never thought a single movement could express such utter exhaustion and despair. Imagine my state. I stopped 20 or 30 paces from the bench where this unfortunate man lay sprawled, not knowing what to do. On one hand, the desire to help. On the other, the fear instilled since childhood of speaking to a stranger on the street. The gas lamps flickered dimly under the low, cloud-covered sky. Occasional, sparse figures passed by. It was approaching midnight, and I was almost alone with this grim shadow. 5, 10 times I made to approach, but each time I was held back by shame or perhaps a secret fear, for falling man can drag down the one trying to save him. The whole time, I felt the absurdity, even the comicality of my position. But I could neither speak, nor leave, nor remain indifferent. And I hope you will believe me. Perhaps for a whole hour, an endless hour, while the invisible sea of time measured out the moments, I stood there, shocked, hypnotized by the spectacle of a human being utterly annihilated. I lacked the resolve to say or do anything. I would have stood there until dawn or, yielding to the voice of prudence, gone home. I remember I had almost decided to abandon this unfortunate man to his fate. But the elements intervened. It began to rain. All evening the wind had been driving heavy spring clouds from the sea. The air was stifling. The sky hung low, and now the first drop fell, followed by a heavy, solid downpour, lashed by the wind. I rushed under the awning of a kiosk, but even an open umbrella was no protection. The gusting wind leaped, swirled, drenching my dress with spray. The drops lashed the ground furiously. Cold water dust stung my face and hands. And this was so terrifying that even after 25 years my heart contracts at the memory. He remained sitting on the bench in the pouring rain. Water gushed from the drain pipes. The rumble of carriages came from the town. Figures with raised collars flitted past. Everything living was taking shelter, seeking cover. Only this black lump on the bench did not move, did not stir. I have already said, this man possessed a magical ability to express every feeling through movement. And nothing in the world could convey despair, the renunciation of life, with such force as this immobility. It was death in life, indifference to the downpour, the inability to rise, to walk a few steps to shelter, a dead indifference to his own existence. No sculptor, no poet, not Michelangelo, nor Dante, had ever made me feel the ultimate agony so acutely as this living man beneath the raging elements, too exhausted to take a single step. I could bear it no longer. I rushed to him through the cold, lashing rain, and shook him. "Come with me," I said. Something flickered in his dull gaze. He moved his hand weakly, but did not understand. "Come with me," I repeated, now with force, almost angrily, tugging his wet sleeve. Then he slowly, limply stood up. "What do you want?" he asked. I did not know what to answer. I did not know where to take him. Only away from here, away from this rain, from this posture of suicidal despair. I did not let go of his hand, dragging the listless body to the kiosk, with a narrow ledge of the roof offered at least some protection from the furious onslaught of rain and wind. I was no longer thinking of anything. I wanted nothing. Only to get him under a roof, to a dry place. I had no other thoughts. And so we found ourselves side by side, on a narrow strip barely sheltered from the rain under the tiny awning of the kiosk. Behind us were shuttered windows. Above our heads, a miserable shelter, and around us an unrelenting downpour, dashing our faces and clothes with icy spray. The situation was becoming unbearable. I could no longer simply stand next to this drenched stranger, but having brought him here, I couldn't just walk away without a word. Something had to happen. I forced myself to look at the situation soberly. The best thing, I thought, would be to take him by carriage to his home and then return to my own hotel. Tomorrow he would find his own way out. I asked, still standing beside him while he stared motionlessly into the darkness. "Where do you live?" "I have no apartment. I only arrived from Nice this evening. You can't come to me." The meaning of his words didn't register immediately. Only a moment later did I understand that he had taken me for a cocotte, one of those women who loiter around the casino at night, hoping to extract money from a lucky gambler or a drunk. And what else could he have thought? Only now, as I tell you this, do I realize the full improbability and fantastical nature of my position. The brusqueness with which I had snatched him from the bench and dragged him along was indeed not in keeping with the behavior of a respectable woman. But at the time, I didn't think of that. Only later, too late, did I guess his monstrous misunderstanding. Otherwise, I would never have uttered the words which only aggravated the misapprehension. Then we must take a room in a hotel. You can't stay here. You need shelter somewhere. It was then I understood his terrible mistake. He didn't even turn to me, but threw out with a sneer. No, I don't need a room. I don't need anything at all. Don't trouble yourself. You won't squeeze anything out of me. You got the wrong man. I have no money. This was said with such horrifying indifference that I had no time even to be offended. I was so utterly shocked. He stood there, soaked to the bone, emptied, leaning lifelessly against the wall. I was seized by the same feeling that had gripped me the moment he staggered out of the hall, and which had not released me throughout this fantastically absurd hour. Before me was a living, young creature, doomed to perish, and I had to save him. I moved closer. Don't worry about money. Come. You can't stay here. I'll arrange something for you. Don't think about anything. Just come, please. He turned his head. The rain drummed dully around us. Water from a drain pipe streamed down at our feet. I realized he was trying to see my face in the dark for the first time. He stirred, as if slowly awakening from lethargy. Well, as you wish, he said, surrendering. It's all the same to me. All right, let's go. I opened my umbrella. He came over and took my arm. This sudden familiarity struck me unpleasantly, even frightened me. My heart contracted, but I didn't dare pull away. If I pushed him off now, he would be lost, and all I had done would have been in vain. We walked a few steps to the casino. Only then did I begin to wonder what to do next. The decision came quickly to take him to some inexpensive hotel, thrust some money into his hand so he could spend the night and leave for home tomorrow. I didn't think beyond that. Carriages were pulling up to the casino. I hailed one, and we got in. When the coachman asked where to, I was at a loss. I understood they wouldn't accept my drenched companion at a fashionable hotel, and, inexperienced in such situations, not thinking of the ambiguity, I called out, to some simpler hotel. The coachman indifferently shook the reins. My companion remained silent. The wheels clattered. The rain beat fiercely against the window. Locked in this cramped, coffin-like box, I felt as if I were transporting a dead body. I tried to find words to break the oppressive silence, but nothing came to mind. After a few minutes, the carriage stopped. I got out first, and while he, as if sleepwalking, slammed the door shut, I paid the driver. We found ourselves at the entrance to a small, unfamiliar hotel. A narrow glass canopy protected us from the rain, which tore and shredded the impenetrable darkness with fury. He leaned against the wall as if crushed by the weight of his own body. Water dripped from his wet hat and crumpled clothes. He stood like a man just pulled from a river, still not come to his senses. A small puddle formed at his feet. He didn't even attempt to shake himself off, didn't remove his hat, from which drops fell directly onto his face. He didn't care. I cannot convey how profoundly this brokenness shocked me. But I had to act. I reached into my purse. Here are 100 francs, I said. Take a room for yourself and leave for Nice in the morning. He looked at me in surprise. I watched you in the gaming hall, I continued, noticing his hesitation. I know you lost everything, and I'm afraid you intend to do something foolish. There is no shame in accepting help. Here, take it. But he pushed my hand away with unexpected force. You're a good sort, he said, but don't throw your money away. You can't help me anymore. Whether I sleep tonight or not, it doesn't matter. Tomorrow will all be over. It's too late to help me. No, you must take it, I insisted. Tomorrow you will think differently. For now, just go upstairs and rest. By daybreak, everything will seem different. When I offered him the money, he pushed my hand away almost with venom. Keep it, he repeated dully. There's no point. I'd rather do it on the street than soil a stranger's room with my blood. 100 francs won't save me, nor would 1,000. I'd just go back to the casino tomorrow and play until I'd lost it all, down to the last cent. Why start over? I've had enough. You cannot imagine how deeply that muffled, broken voice penetrated my soul. Think of it. Standing beside you, breathing, living, is a handsome young man, and you know that unless you summon all your strength, in 2 hours this thinking, speaking, breathing youth will be a corpse. I was seized by a furious, desperate desire to overcome this senseless resistance. I grabbed his arm. Enough. You will go upstairs this instant and take a room. And tomorrow morning I will take you to the station. You must leave this place. You are obliged to return home. I will not rest until I see you on a train with a ticket in your hand. At your age, one does not throw away one's life over a loss, be it 100 or 1,000 francs. This is weakness, hysteria, meaningless rage. Tomorrow you will admit I was right. Tomorrow, he repeated with a grim smirk. Tomorrow. If only you knew where I will be tomorrow. If only I knew myself. It's curious. No, go home. My dear, don't trouble yourself. Don't throw your money away. But I did not relent. I was possessed by a kind of obsession, a frantic stubbornness. I gripped his hand tightly and thrust the banknotes into it. You will take this money and go upstairs immediately. With these words, I walked decisively to the bell. That's it, I've rung. The porter will come out. You will go up and go to sleep. Tomorrow, at 9 o'clock sharp, I will meet you here and take you to the station. Don't worry about anything. I will arrange it all. Now go to bed. You need to sleep. Don't think about anything else. At that very second, the lock clicked and the door opened. Come on, he said suddenly, sharply, his voice turning hard and embittered. I felt his fingers clamp around my arm like an iron band. I was frightened, so frightened that I felt stunned, my mind clouded. I wanted to resist, to pull away, but my will was paralyzed. You must understand me. I could not struggle with this stranger. I was ashamed before the porter who stood in the doorway, waiting for us to enter. And so, I found myself inside. I wanted to say something, to explain, but I couldn't utter a word. His hand lay on mine, heavy, commanding. I dimly realized he was leading me up the stairs. A key jangled, and I found myself alone with this stranger in a strange room, in some hotel whose name I do not know to this day. Mrs. C. fell silent again and suddenly rose from her chair. Her voice seemed to have failed her. She went to the window and stood for several minutes, either looking out at the street or simply standing with her forehead pressed against the cold pane. I did not dare look at her. It was painful to see an elderly woman in such agitation. I sat motionless, asking no questions, saying nothing, simply waiting. Finally, she returned, sat down opposite me, and began to speak calmly. That is all. The most difficult part is said, and I hope you will believe me if I repeat and swear by all that is holy to me, my honor, my children. Until that moment, the thought of intimacy with this man had never crossed my mind. not of my own free will, but completely unconsciously, I found myself in that situation, as if caught in a trap set on my smooth, straight path through life. I swore to be sincere to you and to myself. I repeat, I was drawn into this tragic adventure solely by a frantic desire to help. There could be no question of any personal feelings or motives. You will spare me from recounting what happened that night. I remember everything and wish to forget nothing. That night, I was fighting for his life. I repeat, it was a struggle between life and death. I felt how this stranger, this almost doomed man, clung to me greedily, passionately, like a drowning man to a straw. Even as he fell into the abyss, he seized me with the frenzy of despair. And I, with all my strength, with everything in me, fought for his salvation. Such hours come to a person only once in a lifetime, and then only to one in a million. Had it not been for this chance, I would never have known with what passion, with what frantic greed, a lost man drinks the last drop of living, hot life. I, who had lived until then in complete ignorance of the dark depths of existence, would never have comprehended how bizarrely and powerfully nature intertwines heat and cold, life and death, ecstasy and despair in a single breath. That night was saturated with struggle, words, passion, anger, tears, pleas, and intoxication. It seemed an eternity to me. And we, plunging into the abyss, one frantically, the other uncomprehendingly, emerged from that mortal combat transformed, with new thoughts, with new feelings. But I do not wish to speak of this. I cannot and will not describe anything. I will speak only of the first moment of awakening. I came to from a leaden sleep, casting off the chains of that abyssal night, the like of which I had never known. For a long time, I could not open my eyes. The first thing I saw was a strange ceiling above my head. Then, the outlines of an unfamiliar, alien, repulsive room in which I found myself, not knowing how. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a dream, a light, transparent one following a suffocating nightmare. But outside the window, bright, sharp sunlight. From below, the noise of the street, the clanging of trams, voices. And I understood this was not a dream. This was reality. Involuntarily, I raised myself, trying to remember where I was. And suddenly, I saw something impossible to convey in words. A stranger sleeping beside me in the wide bed. A stranger, a complete stranger, half naked, an unknown man. No, this horror is indescribable. It crashed down upon me, and I fell back onto the pillows, drained of strength. But it was not a saving faint, not a loss of consciousness. On the contrary, I instantly remembered every terrible, incomprehensible thing that had happened to me. The only desire that seized me was to disappear, to die of shame and revulsion. How could I have ended up in some dubious hotel, in a stranger's bed, next to an unknown man? I remember clearly how my heart seemed to stop. I held my breath, as if hoping to thereby, in my life, to extinguish consciousness, this agonizingly clear, terrifyingly sober consciousness that understood everything but could not comprehend it. I don't know how long I lay in this stupor. Presumably, this is how the dead lie in their coffins. I only remember closing my eyes and appealing to God, to the heavenly powers, begging for all to be a dream, a fiction. But my senses were heightened to the extreme. They wouldn't allow me to deceive myself. I heard voices in the next room, the sound of splashing water, the shuffling of steps in the corridor, and all of it confirmed. This was reality, cruel, implacable reality. It's impossible to say how long this torment lasted. Such moments exist by different laws of time. But suddenly a different fear gripped me. Piercing, chilling. What if he wakes up and speaks to me? I realized I had only one way out, to dress and leave while he was still asleep. Never to set eyes on him again. Never to speak to him, to escape by flight before it was too late. Quickly, away from here, back to my own life, to my own hotel, and on the first train, away from this cursed place, from this country. Never to meet him again, never to look him in the eye, to have no witness, no accuser, no accomplice. This thought gave me strength. Cautiously, stealthily, almost like a thief, I inched my way from the bed to my dress. I dressed with the utmost care, trembling all over, expecting him to wake at any second. And finally, I succeeded. I was ready. Only my hat remained, lying at the foot of the bed. Tiptoeing towards it, I couldn't help it. I had to look one more time at the face of this stranger who had crashed into my life like a stone from a ledge. One single look, and what then? Strangely, this young man, deep in sleep, was truly a stranger. For a moment, I didn't even recognize him. It was as if yesterday's features, distorted by passion, contorted by convulsions, had vanished. Before me was a completely different face. Childlike, boyish, clear, pure. Lips, yesterday clenched and bitten, were now softly, dreamily parted, almost smiling. Light, wavy locks lay softly on his smooth brow, and his even breath made his chest rise and fall in gentle waves. Remember, I said I had never seen such frantic excitement as on his face at the gaming table. But nor had I seen such a radiant, truly blissful peace, even on the faces of infants, illuminated in sleep by angelic purity. In this face, which had reflected the finest nuances of feeling, there now reigned a heavenly detachment from worries and cares. And in that moment, all my fears, all my doubts slipped from me like a heavy black cloak. I was no longer ashamed. I was almost joyful. All the terrible, incomprehensible things suddenly acquired meaning. I felt joy, pride at the thought that if I had not sacrificed myself, this fragile, beautiful youth would now be lying somewhere on a rock, bloodied, his face contorted, his eyes staring wildly. But now he was saved, and I had saved him. I looked at him with a maternal gaze. There is no other word for it. As upon a child, I had brought back to life, as if I had given birth to him anew, with pains greater than those of bearing my own children. Perhaps it sounds strange, but in that dirty, wretched room, in that shabby hotel, I felt as if I were standing in a temple. A blissful sensation of miracle, of sanctity, swept over me. From the most terrible minute of my life, another had been born, the most luminous, the most enlightened. I don't know if I brushed against something or if a word escaped my lips, but he suddenly opened his eyes. I started. He began to look around, as if struggling to awaken from a deep sleep. His gaze wandered over the unfamiliar room, then settled on me. But before he could speak, I had already regained control. I must not let him utter a word. I must not allow any question, any familiarity, any explanations. I must go, I said quickly. You get dressed. We will meet at the entrance to the casino at 12 o'clock. I will take care of everything else there. And without waiting for an answer, I ran out. I just couldn't bear to see that room anymore. I fled the hotel without a backward glance. A hotel whose name I didn't know, just as I didn't know the name of the man with whom I had spent the night. Mrs. C paused for a moment. When she spoke again, the previous tension had left her voice, like a wagon that, having struggled to the top of a hill, rolls down the other side with ease and speed. Her words now flowed freely and naturally. I ran back to my hotel through streets bathed in morning sunshine. After yesterday's downpour, the air was fresh, transparent, and it was the same in my soul. Remember, I told you, after my husband's death, I had renounced life. My children no longer needed me. I was a burden to myself, and an existence without purpose was meaningless. And now, for the first time, I had been given a task. By saving a man, I had, with a tremendous effort of will, snatched him back from oblivion. A few more obstacles remained to be overcome, and my goal would be achieved. I rushed into the hotel. The porter greeted me with a look of surprise. After all, I was returning only at 9 in the morning. But I didn't care. Neither shame nor vexation oppressed me. The desire to live, the joyful awareness that I was needed by someone, stirred my blood with passion. In my room, I changed quickly. Only later did I notice I had unconsciously taken off my morning dress and put on a light-colored one. Then I went to the bank for money, hurried to the station to check the train schedules, and with unusual energy managed to do several other errands. All that remained was to arrange the departure. The final rescue of the man fate had thrown my way as a challenge. To be honest, I was afraid of meeting him. Everything that happened yesterday was like a whirlwind, like the collision of two stones torn loose by a waterfall. We barely knew each other by face, and I wasn't sure he would recognize me. Yesterday, that was blind chance, madness, the intoxication of two distraught souls. But today I had to appear before him in the bright, merciless light of day, as a living woman, as I truly am. But it was all simpler than I thought. I had barely approached the casino at the appointed hour when he jumped up from the bench and hurried towards me. What joyful surprise, what childlike spontaneity there was in his, as always, expressive movements. He rushed to me, his eyes shining with gratitude, sincere, respectful gratitude, and, sensing my embarrassment, he cast down his eyes. One so rarely encounters genuine gratitude, and most often, those who feel it most deeply cannot find the words, are ashamed, remain silent, or speak irrelevantly. But this man, as if created by God to be a sculptor of emotion, knew how to express the movements of the soul with astonishing clarity. His whole being radiated a warm, passionate thankfulness. He bent over my hand, bowed his head reverently, barely touched my fingers with his lips, then stepped back and with gentle courtesy inquired after my health. There was so much modesty in his words, in his gaze, that all my fears dissipated. And as if reflecting this newfound clarity of feeling, everything around us celebrated its deliverance from yesterday's nightmare. The sea, grim and dark the day before, was now calm and transparent, every pebble beneath the gentle swell gleaming white. The casino, which yesterday had seemed like hell, raised its Moorish gables to the steely sky, and the kiosk, under whose awning the rain had sheltered us yesterday, had been transformed into a flower stall where amidst greenery lay piles of white, red, and yellow flowers sold by a young girl in a bright, colorful blouse. I invited him to lunch with me in a small restaurant. There he told me his tragic story, and it fully confirmed everything I had intuitively felt when I first saw his trembling, nervous hands on the green baize. He came from an old family of Galician Poles. His parents were preparing him for a diplomatic career. He studied in Vienna and a month ago had successfully passed his first examination. To celebrate the event, his uncle, a general staff officer with whom he lived, took him to the Prater for the races. His uncle was lucky. He won 3 times in a row, and with a wad of won money, they went to dine at an expensive restaurant. The next day, as a reward for his success, his father sent him his monthly allowance. 2 days earlier, this sum would have seemed substantial to him, but now, after his easy winnings, he regarded it with indifference. Right after lunch, he went back to the races, betting recklessly, feverishly, and by a whim of fate or misfortune, he tripled what he had received. Thus began his passion for gambling. He gambled at the racetrack, in cafes, in clubs. The game devoured his time, his strength, his nerves, and, above all, his money. He could no longer think of anything else, lost his sleep, ceased to control himself. Once, returning home at night from a club where he had lost everything, he found a forgotten, crumpled banknote in his pocket while undressing. Unable to resist, he dressed again and wandered the streets until he found a cafe where they played dominoes, and sat there until dawn. Once, his married sister had bailed him out, paying off debts to moneylenders who were only too willing to lend to the heir of a well-known family. At first, his luck returned, but soon it deserted him again, and the more he lost, the more desperately he strove for a big win to cover his obligations and his debts of honor. He had long since pawned his watch, his suits, and finally, the terrible thing happened. He stole a pair of pearl earrings from his elderly aunt, which she almost never wore. He pawned one, and that very evening won 4 times its value. But instead of redeeming the earring, he risked everything and lost. The theft hadn't been discovered yet, so he pawned the second one and, yielding to a sudden impulse, left for Monte Carlo to obtain the wealth he so coveted. He had already sold his suitcase, his clothes, his umbrella. He had nothing left but a revolver with 4 bullets and a small jeweled cross, a gift from his godmother, Princess X. He had struggled to part with this cross for a long time, but the day before he had lost it too, for 50 francs, just to experience once more the ultimate thrill of gambling, not for life, but for death. He recounted all of this with enchanting vivacity, with an animation that captivates the listener from the very first words. I listened to him, enthralled, shaken, as if spellbound. And I did not even think to be indignant that the man sitting opposite me was in essence a thief. If, the day before, someone had told me, a woman with an impeccable past, strictly observant of social conventions, that I would be having a friendly conversation with a stranger young enough to be my son, who had moreover stolen pearl earrings, I would have thought it madness. But as he told his story, I felt neither fear nor revulsion. He spoke so simply, so sincerely, as if describing not a crime, but an illness of feverish delirium. And after that night, when I had experienced something so shattering, the word impossible had lost all meaning for me. In those 10 hours, I had learned more about life than in 40 years of a measured, prosperous existence. But what frightened me was not the confession of theft, but something else, the feverish glitter in his eyes when he spoke of the game. It was as if an electric current ran across his face, making every muscle quiver. The mere memory of his experience agitated him to the point of trembling, and his expressive face reflected all the vicissitudes of the game with frightening clarity. His hands, slender, nervous, beautiful, began again to dart across the tablecloth like hunted little animals. I saw them tremble, contort, clench convulsively, then start up and claw at each other again. And when he reached the episode of the theft, I involuntarily shuddered. His fingers leaped up with lightning speed, made a grasping motion, and his palm seemed to swallow an invisible jewel. With inexpressible horror, I had understood. This man was poisoned to his very core by his passion. It was this that struck me, the slavish submission to a ruinous craving, which had subjugated this young man, by nature carefree and pure of heart. I felt it was my duty, as a friend, to persuade him to leave Monte Carlo immediately, before it was too late, before the theft was discovered, while his name and future could still be saved. I promised to give him money for the journey and to redeem the jewels, but on the condition that he leave today and swear to me on his honor never to touch cards or gamble again. I will never forget the gratitude, at first humble, then increasingly radiant and passionate, with which he listened to me. He seemed to drink in my words, and when I promised help, he suddenly reached his hands across the table, seized my palms with a reverent gesture, as if taking a sacred vow. His light eyes, usually slightly veiled, filled with tears. His whole body trembled, with excitement, with happiness. I have tried many times to describe his expressive gestures, his mimicry, but the look in his eyes at that moment, it was indescribable. It held an ecstatic, unearthly rapture, such as one rarely sees on a human face. It was like that white shadow one sometimes glimpses upon waking, as if the vanishing countenance of an angel were before you. And I could not withstand that gaze. Gratitude is always touching, but to see it so clearly is a rarity. Such sensitivity penetrates the heart, and for me, a reserved, sober person, such expansiveness was something salutary, almost sacred. And furthermore, not only had this unfortunate youth returned to life, nature itself had revived. When we left the restaurant, the sea sparkled dazzlingly, calmly, its blue merging with the azure of the sky, where white seagulls soared. You know the Riviera landscape, of course. It is always beautiful, but often like a postcard, serene, bright, lazy, indifferent to the gaze. Like a lush harem beauty, it reveals itself without showing interest. But there are rare days when this beauty awakens, as if calling out to you, flashing with colors, throwing a profusion of bright flowers in your face, blazing with sensuality. Such a day had been born from the chaos of the stormy night. The rain-washed streets glistened, the sky glowed with turquoise, bushes flared like multicolored torches amidst the lush, moisture-laden greenery. The air was so transparent that the mountains seemed closer, lighter, as if they were crowding curiously around the sparkling little town. Everything around sounded a brisk, insistent call, and the heart answered involuntarily. "Let's take a carriage," I said, "and drive along the promenade." He nodded joyfully. It was probably the first time since his arrival that he was truly seeing nature. Until now, he had known only the stuffy casino hall, saturated with heavy smells, the crowd of people with faces distorted by passion, and the gray, noisy sea. But now the sun-drenched coast lay spread out before us, and his admiring gaze wandered over the clear distances. We rode slowly in a carriage. There were no automobiles then. Along the wonderful road, past countless villas. View succeeded view, and at every house, every villa nestled in the greenery of pines, a secret desire arose. One could live here quietly, peacefully, far from the world. Have I ever been happier in my life than during that hour? I do not know. Beside me sat the young man who, just yesterday, was suffocating in the grip of despair and fate, but now, as if winged, enchanted by the sparkling stream of sunlight. He seemed to have grown years younger, become a mere boy, handsome, vibrant, with a gaze both cheerful and respectful. What impressed me most was his sensitivity. The moment the ascent grew steeper and the horses labored more, he would immediately jump down to help the carriage. If I pointed to a flower by the roadside, he hurried to pick it for me. A little toad, crawling slowly across the road after yesterday's rain. He carefully carried to the grass so it wouldn't be crushed by the wheels. And all the while he laughed, told charming, funny stories. In this laughter lay his salvation. Otherwise, he would have sung, jumped, or raved with delight. So rapturously intoxicated was he with life. When we slowly passed through a tiny mountain village, he suddenly doffed his hat respectfully. I was surprised. Whom was he greeting here? A stranger among strangers? To my question, he replied, blushing slightly and as if excusing himself, that we had passed a church, and that in Poland, as in all strictly Catholic countries, one is taught from childhood to remove one's hat before every church and chapel. This respect for a holy site moved me. Remembering the cross he had mentioned, I asked if he was a believer. He answered, somewhat embarrassed, that he hoped to be worthy of God's grace. And then an idea came to me. Stop! I called to the coachman and stepped hastily out of the carriage. He followed me, surprised. Where are you going? He asked. I answered briefly. Follow me. We walked a few steps back along the road and approached a small brick chapel. The door was open. Inside, whitewashed walls, the dim light of candles, the smell of incense. My companion removed his hat, dipped his hand into the stoup of holy water, crossed himself, and knelt down. When he rose, I took his hand. Go to the altar or to an image that is dear to you, and take a vow, the one I will give you. He looked at me with surprise, almost alarm, but he understood immediately, went to a niche, crossed himself, and knelt again. Repeat after me, I said, trembling with emotion. Repeat. I swear, he repeated. I continued, that I will never again take part in any form of gambling for money, that I will never again risk my life and honor for this passion. He repeated my words with a tremor, clearly, loudly, and they echoed in the empty church like a solemn oath. A silence fell, so profound that from outside came the rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. And suddenly, like a penitent sinner in a prayerful ecstasy the likes of which I had never seen, he began to speak rapidly, with a frantic volubility, in Polish. It was a fervent prayer of thanksgiving and penitence. His head bowed again and again. His speech grew more and more passionate, and one word he repeated with increasing heat, increasing fervor. Never before or since have I heard such a prayer in any church in the world. His hands clutched the back of a pew convulsively. His whole body shook from an inner storm. He saw nothing, felt nothing, as if he were in another world, in the fire of transfiguration, in heavenly spheres. Finally, he rose slowly, crossed himself, and turned to me, weary. His knees trembled. His face was as pale as that of a man exhausted to the limit. But when he looked at me, his eyes shone, and a pure, truly pious smile illuminated his features. He approached, bowed in the Russian manner, took my hands, and reverently raised them to his lips. You were sent to me by God. I have thanked him. I could find no words to reply. But in my soul, I wished for an organ to suddenly sound under the vaults. So strongly did I feel. I had achieved my goal. This man was saved forever. We left the church into the radiant, streaming light of the May day. The world had never seemed so beautiful to me. For another 2 hours, we drove along the picturesque road winding through the hills, and around every bend new, charming vistas opened up. But we were silent. After such an explosion of feeling, words seemed superfluous. And when our glances met by chance, I turned away in confusion. So powerfully was I stirred by the spectacle of the miracle I had wrought. Around 5 in the evening, we returned to Monte Carlo. I had a visit to relatives which I could not avoid. Frankly, in the depths of my soul, I craved peace. There had been too much happiness. I felt I needed to rest from this state of rapture, which I was experiencing for the first time. So I asked my charge to come to my hotel for just a minute. In my room, I gave him the money for the journey and to redeem the jewels. We agreed that during my absence he would buy his ticket, and that at 7 o'clock we would meet in the station lobby, half an hour before the departure of the train, which would carry him home via Genoa. When I handed him the 5 banknotes, his lips turned white. "No, not the money. Please, no," he whispered hoarsely, pulling back his trembling fingers. "No, I can't bear to see it," he repeated, as if experiencing physical revulsion or fear. I tried to calm him, saying it was merely a loan, that if he felt uncomfortable taking it, he could give me a receipt. Yes, yes, a receipt," he mumbled, averting his eyes. He crumpled the banknotes as if they were something sticky, unpleasant, stuffed them into his pocket without looking, and quickly, with broad strokes, scrawled a few words on a piece of paper. When he lifted his head, his forehead was damp with sweat. He seemed to be in the grip of a fever. Handing me the slip of paper, he shuddered as if a current had run through his body, and suddenly I instinctively recoiled. He dropped to his knees and kissed the hem of my dress. There was so much feeling in this gesture that my whole body trembled. A strange confusion seized me, and I could only whisper, "Thank you for your gratitude, but please go now. At 7 o'clock, in the station lobby, we will say goodbye." He looked at me. Tears of emotion clouded his eyes. For a moment, I thought he wanted to say something, that he was about to rush towards me. But he merely bowed deeply and left. Mrs. C. broke off her story again. She stood up, went to the window, and stood motionless for a long time, looking out at the street. Her shoulders trembled slightly. Suddenly, she turned sharply. Her hands, until then so calm, made an impulsive, jerking movement, as if tearing something apart. Then she looked at me firmly, almost defiantly, and continued, "I promised to speak frankly, and now I understand how necessary that was." Only now, forcing myself for the first time to describe everything that happened that day, try to clothe a tangle of vague sensations in clear words, do I begin to understand much that I did not realize then, or did not want to realize. So I want to tell the truth to myself and to you. The moment he walked out of the room and I was left alone, I felt a blow to my heart that made my vision darken. Something had hurt me cruelly, agonizingly, but I didn't know why, or I didn't want to know. Why did the touching reverence of my protege wound me so deeply? Now, as I mercilessly excavate the past from my memory, looking at it from the outside, now that I have called you as a witness and have no right to hide feelings, it is shameful to confess. Now, I have no doubts. What hurt me then was disappointment. He had left so obediently, without trying to hold me back, to stay by my side. He had submitted to my request to leave instead of embracing me. He saw in me a saint who had appeared on his path, but not a woman. It was disappointment, the very thing I would not admit to myself, then or later. But a woman feels everything with her heart, without words. And now I no longer deceive myself. If he had embraced me in that moment, called to me, I would have followed him to the ends of the earth. I would have disgraced my name, my children's name, scorned gossip and the voice of reason. I would have run away with him, like Madame Henriette with the young Frenchman she hadn't known the day before. I wouldn't have asked where or for how long. I wouldn't have cast a backward glance at my former life. I would have sacrificed my good name, my fortune, my honor for him. I would have begged for alms, and there was perhaps no baseness to which he could not have persuaded me. Everything people call shame and caution, I would have cast aside if he had said but one word, taken but one step towards me. In that moment, I was completely in his power. But I've already told you, he no longer saw me as a woman. And with what force, with what devotion I yearned for him, I understood only when I was left alone. When the passion that had just flickered across his clear, almost unearthly face now constricted my chest with the full weight of unrequited feeling. I struggled to regain my composure, thinking with disgust of the visit to my relatives. It felt as if an iron helmet were on my head, constricting my brow and pressing me towards the ground. When I finally went to the hotel opposite where my relatives were staying, my thoughts were tangled, my legs unsteady. I sat dully among the cheerfully chattering people and started every time I accidentally looked up and saw their immobile faces. Compared to that living face, so like a play of light and shadow, they seemed like masks. I felt I was among the dead. So lifeless was this company. And as I dropped sugar into my cup and absently kept up my end of the conversation, another face rose before me with every beat of my heart. The face I was terrifyingly to see for the last time. I must have sighed or groaned involuntarily, because my husband's cousin leaned towards me. What was wrong? Was I well? I looked so pale, as if something were troubling me. I seized on her question at once, said I had a terrible migraine, and asked permission to leave. Now I belonged to myself again. I hurried back to my hotel, and the moment I was alone, a feeling of emptiness, of abandonment, swept over me, and a longing for the youth I was to leave forever awoke. I paced the room frantically, pulled out drawers needlessly, changed my dress, my ribbon, then stood before the mirror, staring intently at myself. Perhaps in this outfit I could still hold his attention. And suddenly I understood what I wanted, to do anything, just not to let him go. In the space of one fateful second, this desire became a decision. I ran downstairs to the porter and told him I was leaving on the evening train. I had to hurry. I rang for the maid to help me pack. Time was desperately short, as she and I raced to pack dresses and sundries into the suitcase. I dreamed of how I would see him off, and at the very last moment, just as he was reaching out to say goodbye, I would, to his astonishment, step into the compartment with him, to spend that night with him, and the next, as many as he wanted. I was in a kind of intoxicating frenzy. Tossing dresses into the trunk, I laughed out loud, to the maid's surprise. I dimly realized I had lost myself. When the servant came for the luggage, I looked at him in bewilderment. It was hard to think of such mundane things when I was beside myself with excitement. I was desperately afraid of being late. It was probably close to 7, leaving me with at best 20 minutes before the train's departure. True, I consoled myself. I wasn't going to say goodbye. I had resolved to accompany him, to be by his side for as long as he would allow me. The servant had already taken my suitcases down, and I hurried to the hotel cashier to settle my bill. The manager was already handing me my change. I was about to leave, when suddenly a hand gently touched my shoulder. I started. It was my cousin, worried about my indisposition, which I had feigned for her benefit. She had come to check on me. My vision darkened. I couldn't receive her. Every second's delay could be fatal. But politeness demanded I give her at least a little attention. "You must go to bed," she insisted. "You certainly have a fever." I probably did. My temples were throbbing. Blue circles flickered before my eyes. I was on the verge of fainting. I refused to lie down, thanked her for her concern, though every word burned me, and I wanted to shove her out, along with her intrusive solicitude. But she wouldn't leave. No, she wouldn't leave. She offered me eau de cologne, rubbed my temples herself, while I counted the minutes, thought of him, feverishly sought a way to rid myself of this tormenting care. The more agitated I became, the more her anxiety grew. Finally, she tried almost by force to take me back to my room. And suddenly, amidst her persuasions, I glanced at the clock in the lobby. 28 minutes past 7, and the train was due to leave at 7:35. Abruptly, almost rudely, I thrust my hand out to her. "Goodbye. I must go," and, ignoring her bewildered look, dashed past the surprised porters, rushed out onto the street, and ran towards the station. From the agitated gesticulations of the servant waiting for me with the luggage on the platform, I understood. I was too late. I rushed toward the barrier, but was stopped by the ticket inspector. I had forgotten to buy a ticket. While I pleaded with him desperately to let me through, the train began to move. Trembling, I peered into the windows, hoping to see at least a glance, a wave, a sign. But in the swift rush of the carriages, I could no longer make out his face. The carriages flew by faster and faster, and within a minute there was nothing left, only a black, smoky cloud. I stood for a long time, as if turned to stone. The servant probably tried to speak to me several times before he ventured to touch my arm. Only then did I come to my senses. Return to the hotel? It took a minute or two before I could collect my thoughts. No, it was impossible. To return there after my absurd, reckless departure? Never. I wanted to be alone, and I told him to put the luggage in the left luggage office. And only now, amidst the station's bustle and the swirl of faces, did I try to think clearly about how to cope with the feeling of anger, longing, and despair that was choking me. I must confess, the thought that I had, through my own fault, missed our final meeting seared me like a red-hot iron. The pain became unbearable, and I could barely restrain myself from screaming. There are such moments in life, rare as an avalanche, swift as a storm, when everything one has lived, everything accumulated, suddenly comes crashing down on a person. Never, before or since, have I experienced such a collapse of hope, such helpless rage, as in that second when, having resolved on a desperate step, ready to shatter my entire settled life with one blow, I suddenly found myself before a deaf, senseless wall against which my passion shattered helplessly. What happened next? Of course, I acted absurdly, stupidly. I'm almost ashamed to tell it, but I promised myself, and you, to hide nothing. I wanted to get him back. Not him himself, but the moments I had spent by his side. I was irresistibly drawn to the places where we had been together, to the bench from which I had lifted him, to the gaming hall where I had first seen him, even to that sordid hotel. just to relive it all. And the next day, I planned to take a carriage and drive along the same promenade, the same road, so that every word, every gesture would come alive in me again. Yes, so great, so childlike was my confusion. But consider how swiftly all this had crashed down upon me. I had experienced it as one stunning blow. And now, rudely awakened from my intoxication, I want to savor the experience once more, drop by drop, with the help of that magical self-deception we call memory. Not everyone will understand this desire. Perhaps one needs a blazing heart to comprehend it. And so, I went to the casino to find the table where he had sat, and among the other hands, to imagine his hands. I entered the hall. I remembered where he was sitting when I first saw him, at the table on the left in the second room. Every one of his movements was so vividly pictured in my mind that I could have found his place with my eyes closed. I walked towards it, and then, standing in the doorway, I cast a glance over the crowd, and something strange happened to me. There in the very spot I had pictured him, sat he. Was this a feverish delusion, a hallucination? He, exactly as my imagination had just painted him, just like yesterday, with eyes glued to the ball, deathly pale. Yes, I was so terrified I nearly screamed. But the vision was so absurd that I immediately regained control. I shut my eyes. You've gone mad. You have a fever. I told myself. It's impossible. He's gone. Only after that did I open my eyes again. But, to my horror, the vision had not vanished. No doubt remained. He was still sitting there. Among a million hands, I would have recognized his hands. No, I wasn't dreaming. It was he. He had not left, as he had sworn to do. The madman was sitting here. He had brought the money I gave him for his journey to the green table, and, in complete self-oblivion, was playing again, while I, in my despair, was yearning for him with all my heart. A furious rage seized me. Everything swam before my eyes, and I nearly rushed at him to grab this oath-breaker by the throat. This man who had so shamelessly betrayed my trust, trampled my feelings, and spurned my devotion. But I regained control in time. With deliberate slowness, oh, how it cost me! I approached the table and took a seat opposite him. A gentleman had courteously yielded his chair to me. 2 meters of green baize separated us, and I could observe him as if from a theater box, watching that very face which, just 2 hours ago, had shone with gratitude, illuminated by a divine light, and was now once again contorted by the torments of gambling obsession. Those same hands which, during the day, had gripped the prayer bench in the ecstasy of a sacred vow, were now crooked, greedy as a vampire's, and fondled the money with a morbid passion. He must have won a great deal. A whole pile of jetons, Louis d'Or, and banknotes towered before him. A fortune in which his trembling, nervous fingers bathed with bliss. I saw him lovingly smooth out the banknotes, roll the coins, and then, with feverish excitement, throw a handful onto one of the squares. Immediately, the wings of his nose began to twitch. The croupier's call tore his eyes from the money, and, completely absorbed in contemplation, he followed the bouncing ball as if chained by his elbows to the green cloth. His obsession manifested itself more terribly, more agonizingly than yesterday. Every one of his movements killed the radiant, almost saintly image I had so credulously imprinted on my heart. We were just 2 meters apart. I stared directly at him, but he didn't notice me. He didn't see me, didn't see anyone. His gaze, tearing itself from the banknotes and coins, feverishly followed the ball, then rushed back to the money. All his thoughts, his entire being, revolved in this closed circle. The whole world, all of humanity, had shrunk for him to a piece of green baize divided into squares. I knew I could stand here for hours. He would not notice my presence. But I could bear it no longer. Suddenly, resolute, I walked around the table and, approaching him from behind, gripped his shoulder firmly. He turned around and looked at me with a dazed, bewildered expression, like a drunkard who has just been shaken awake, looking with a bleary, unseeing gaze. Then he seemed to recognize me. His lips quivered. He looked at me joyfully and whispered, mysteriously, confidentially, "All is well." I knew when I came in and saw he was here. I knew. I didn't understand whom he meant. I saw only that he was intoxicated by the game, that this madman had forgotten everything, the vow, our agreement, me, the whole world. But even in the face of his madness, I couldn't hold back and, yielding to an impulse, asked with astonishment whom he was talking about. That old man there, the Russian general with one arm, he whispered, pressing close to me so no one would hear his magical secret. See, with the gray side whiskers and a servant standing behind his chair. He always wins. I watched him yesterday, too. He must have a system. I bet on the same numbers he does. He won all the time yesterday, too. I just made a mistake, kept playing after he left. That was my error. He won about 20,000 francs yesterday, and he wins every time today. I follow his bets. Right now, he suddenly broke off his sentence. The croupier's sharp call, "Fate vas Jew," rang out, and his gaze greedily shot to where the gray-bearded Russian general sat calmly. The latter, unhurriedly, placed one gold coin on number 4, then, after a pause, a second one. And immediately, the familiar trembling fingers darted toward the pile of money. He threw a handful of coins onto the same square. A minute later, the croupier announced, 0, and with one sweep of his rake cleared the entire table. He watched his vanishing money with astonishment. But do you think he turned to me? No, he had completely forgotten me. I had vanished from his life. His entire being was chained to the Russian general, who was coolly rolling 2 gold coins on his palm, pondering which number to place them on. I cannot convey to you my anger, my despair. Imagine my anguish. For this man, I had sacrificed my whole life, and for him, I was merely a fly to be lazily swatted away. Again, a wave of rage rose within me. I seized his arm with such force that he started. "You will get up this instant," I whispered quietly but imperiously. "Remember the oath you swore to me today in the church. You wretched man. You perjure." He looked at me in surprise and suddenly turned pale. A guilty expression appeared in his eyes, like that of a beaten dog. His lips trembled. It seemed he remembered everything and was horrified. "Yes, yes," he stammered. My God, yes, I'm coming. Forgive me." His hand began to scoop up the money, at first impulsively, sharply, but soon the movement slowed as if something were holding it back. His gaze fell once more upon the Russian general, who was just placing a bet. 1 minute, he threw out, tossing 5 gold coins onto the same square as the general. "Just this one game, the last one. I swear, I'll leave right after." He fell silent. The ball began to spin, and he vanished again, slipped away from me, from himself, captured by the vortex of the polished wheel where the tiny ball was whirling madly. Again the croupier's call. Again the rake swept away his 5 gold coins. He had lost. But he didn't turn around. He had forgotten me, forgotten his vow, the word he had given a minute ago. His hand reached again for the diminished pile of money, and his gaze, intoxicated, was fixed on his lucky counterpart. My patience ran out. I shook him again, this time with force. "Get up. Immediately. You said just this one game." But he turned sharply. Not a trace of humility or shame remained on his face. Before me was a man driven to frenzy. His eyes blazed with anger. His lips trembled with rage. "Leave me alone," he hissed. "Go away. You bring me bad luck. When you're near, I always lose. It was so yesterday, and so it is today. Go away." I froze, but his fury ignited my own. "I bring you bad luck," I said. "You lie. You are a thief. You swore to me." I didn't finish. He jumped up, pushed me away, not noticing the commotion rising around us. "Leave me," he shouted beside himself. "I don't need your guardianship. Here's your money." And he threw several 100-franc notes at me. "Now leave me alone." He was shouting uncontrollably at the top of his voice, paying no heed to the hundreds of people around. Everyone was staring, whispering, pointing, laughing. Even from the next hall, curious faces peered in. I felt as if my clothes had been torn from me, and I stood naked before this gawping crowd. "Silence, madam, s'il vous plaît," the croupier said loudly and imperiously, tapping his rake on the table. This was directed at me, destroyed, burning with shame, standing before the mockingly whispering crowd like a strumpet who had been thrown money in her face. 300 impudent eyes stared at me, and then, when I, crushed by humiliation, averted my gaze, I saw a pair of eyes frozen in horror. It was my cousin. She was staring at me, her mouth agape, her hand raised as if in fright. This fell me. Before she could move, I rushed headlong from the hall. I had just enough strength to run to that very bench upon which he had collapsed yesterday. And just like him, I fell onto it, strengthless, will-less, thoughtless. 25 years have passed, but when I remember standing there, humiliated, trampled into the mud by his insult before a crowd of strangers, the blood freezes in my veins. And I think again, how pitiful, worthless, and weak is what we call the soul, the spirit, feeling, if it cannot shatter the suffering body, if one can live through such hours and still breathe, instead of dying, collapsing like a tree struck by lightning. For the pain that pierced me to the marrow could only hurl me onto that bench for a moment, where I lay still, not breathing, aware of nothing but a presentiment of longed-for death. But as I've said, all pain is cowardly. It retreats before the mighty call of life, whose power over the flesh is stronger than over the spirit, stronger than all the lures of death. I myself didn't understand how I managed to get up after such a shock, but I did, not knowing what to do. And suddenly I remembered. My suitcases were already at the station. A thought flared up. Away, quickly away from this cursed place. Without looking around, I rushed to the station, asked when the next train to Paris was. At 10 o'clock, the porter said. I checked my luggage immediately. 10 o'clock, exactly 24 hours after that fateful meeting. 24 hours filled with a storm of contradictory feelings that shattered my inner world forever. But at first, I was aware of nothing but a single word hammering in my temples, boring into my brain like a driven wedge. Away, away, away from this city, away from myself, home, to my family, to my former life. By morning, I was in Paris. From one station to another, from there to Boulogne, from Boulogne to Dover, from Dover to London, from London to my sons. A direct route, nonstop, without reasoning, without thinking. 48 hours, without sleep, without words, without food. 48 hours during which the wheels beat out the same refrain. Away, away, away. When I finally, unexpectedly, entered my son's country house, everyone was alarmed. Evidently, there was something in me, in my look, that gave me away. My son moved to embrace me, to kiss me. I recoiled. The thought of him touching lips I considered defiled was unbearable. I avoided questions, ordered a bath. I needed to wash away, along with the travel dust, the last traces of the passion connected to that obsessed, unworthy man. Then I went up to my room and slept for 12, perhaps 14 hours, a deaf, stony sleep, unlike any I had known before. The sleep of one who understands what it means to lie dead in a coffin. My family cared for me as if I were ill, but their affection pained me. I was ashamed of their devotion, their respect, and I had to restrain myself from shouting in their faces how I had betrayed them all, forgotten them, almost abandoned them, for a mad, raging passion. Later, I moved to a remote French provincial town where I knew not a soul. I was haunted by the obsessive thought that anyone who looked at me would immediately recognize my shame, the transformation that had occurred within me. So profoundly did I feel disgraced, trampled into the dust. Sometimes, waking in my bed in the morning, I would be seized by a chilling fear. I was afraid to open my eyes. The memory of that night when I had awoken suddenly beside a strange, half-naked man would wash over me again. And each time, just as then, I desired only one thing, to die. But time possesses great power, and old age tempers the soul's fervor. One feels the proximity of death. Its black shadow falls across the path. Everything seems less vivid, stirs less anxiety, and dangers no longer lie in wait so sharply. Gradually, I recovered from the shock, and when, many years later, I was introduced to a young Pole, an attaché at the Austrian embassy, and he, in response to my question about that family, informed me that the son of his relative had shot himself in Monte Carlo 10 years prior. I did not even flinch. I felt almost no pain. Perhaps, why hide one's selfishness? I even felt a sense of relief. Now I was no longer threatened by an accidental encounter. No one could bear witness against me except my own memory. From then on, I grew calmer. To grow old is to cease fearing the past. And now you will understand why I decided to tell you about myself, about that episode from my life. When you so ardently defended Madame Henriette and asserted that 24 hours could change a woman's destiny, it seemed to me that you were speaking about me. I was grateful to you. I felt for the first time as if somehow justified. And I thought, if I could pour out my soul just once, perhaps the curse of these memories would weaken, and I could go there tomorrow, cross the threshold of that very hall where fate had overtaken me, without hatred for him or for myself. Then the stone would fall from my soul, lie with its full weight upon the past, and it would resurrect no more. It is good that I was able to tell you all this. Now I feel light, almost joyful. I thank you. Mrs. C. rose, and I understood the story was over. Somewhat embarrassed, I searched for words but found none. She seemed to sense this and quickly said, "No, I beg you don't. I would not wish for you to reply. Thank you for listening to me, and I wish you a pleasant journey." She extended her hand to me. Involuntarily, I raised my eyes, and the face of this elderly woman seemed to me touchingly beautiful. She looked at me kindly, slightly abashed. Whether it was a reflection of bygone passion or a slight confusion, A blush spread over her face right to the roots of her gray hair, and she stood before me like a young girl, agitated by her memories and ashamed of her confession. I was deeply moved. I wanted to express my respect, but my throat constricted. So I bowed low and reverently kissed her faded, slightly trembling hand, like an autumn leaf. Ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to the channel. Share your impressions and thoughts in the comments. I will be pleased to converse with you.